after all the hijinks, setting that up, I'd like to welcome you here for the first event of the new year. You're very welcome, and to all of those of you joining us online as well, you're very welcome. Today we're delighted to welcome Alexander Bernstein, a native of San Francisco, no stranger to that. He did postgraduate studies here at the Academy before returning back to the States and then coming back again. He wrote education, how it led him to develop a musical and physical skills of playing the piano in order to withstand the pressures of performance. So I think at that point, I will see Alexander. Carry on.
To see you all for coming out on this Sunday. This is a great treat for me because as Ellen said, I had been working for the last 5 years at a university in Virginia, and my wife was living here, so she was doing she's a musician as well, and was doing a lot of traveling and instructors and merchants and the pleasures of the life we lead. So it's not so much, add to the greater pool of resources that we all have, like mentally and as well. So each of those, I'll give an overview of kind of that, my approach to the instrument and to music. So I was born in San Francisco, and when I was young, my family moved up to Washington State, a very small rural community on the opposite side of the state from Seattle. So we were still same state, but as America, we were still a 4.5-hour drive away from Seattle, and it was a gorgeous area, wheat fields, but very rural. So there was an amazing piano teacher there. I studied with her through high school, and she really instilled a love of music, and without her, I wouldn't have been anything in terms of music. But being in that rural community, I was, a little isolated, so I didn't kind of know a lot of what was going on. I got some opportunities to solo with the local symphony orchestra, which was great, and some experiences like that. When I was 16, I went to the Aspen Music Festival, and that was really kind of when my eyes were open to, I got to meet some of the Juilliard pre-college students and all this, and see how much they were practicing and what they were doing, and that I really felt like my legs were cut out from underneath me, but it was a great learning experience for me too, and really solidified that music was a career, and physically about how I played. And I'm sure I'd be interested in all of your experiences too. I did a lot of competitions, and when I was in high school, I didn't have a care in the world. I had felt no nerves, and I just got up and played, and things might not have gone well every time, but it was a fairly carefree experience. Whenever I got to Harvard University or college, that all changed, and I started to be a lot more self-conscious. I think I started to think a lot more intellectually about music, which is great, but my confidence was not high, and I was a little bit lost for a while. But instead of being depressed, and I went back to the Aspen Festival and that's kind of what started the Irish journey. So I came with him for a master's, and I told him that I wanted to get into doing some international competitions and really, try to make performing piano, my life. So whenever I arrived at the academy, that was when I really started working hard, started practicing 8 hours a day, starting to learning all the special pieces, doing all the stuff. And John, all my previous teachers, I've been so lucky with the teachers that I have. But primarily, I would say 90 to 95% of what I had worked on with all of my teachers at that point. Primarily, I would say 90 to 95% of what I had worked on with all of my teachers at that point was musical, was intellectual. There wasn't a huge, emphasis put on exactly what to do muscularly at the instrument. And that worked for me for a long time. And there was kind of the sense that maybe if you're, I remember Murray Fry talks about this in his interviews. He talks about the fact that if you are so deeply emotionally and intellectually engaged in the music that you play that your body kind of naturally, physically molds itself around what it needs to do at the instrument to make that come out. While I do think that does happen to a certain extent, my experience is very different. So I threw myself into practicing, all day in my master's degree. And within about 6 months, I started to feel some tingling. Within about 6 months, I started to feel some tingling and had some burning sensations in my arms and with some kind of shooting like little electric shocks that would kind of go to the tips of my fingers, and I kind of think, oh dear. So I went to see a doctor who said, it's a mild case of overuse injury or repetitive strain injury. So just take a little time off, you'll be fine. So I did. That was the spring of the first year of my master's degree, and I took a little bit of rest time, and I had a few cycles of this where I would rest for 4 or 5 days, or maybe a week, and then I'd go do a couple hours of practice for a few days after that, and then it would all kind of come back, and then I repeated this cycle a few times. And I remember one of my college professors, a brilliant musician. I remember one of my college professors, a brilliant musician. His name's Robert Evans. He taught a chamber music class at Harvard, and he one of the things he always used to say was I think it's attributed to Albert Einstein, but I'm not sure if that's actually true. He said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. So I said, well, if I keep taking rest and then keep just practicing again and keep feeling these things, what am I? I'm just going to be in this cycle. So something needs to change. What is going to change? What can I change? What can I think about physically that's actually going to solve these problems? So, like I said before, in my upbringing, I never really thought physically that much, or I never really thought muscularly. So, it was over the course of a few months. I I would sit at the piano for hours of just kind of playing scales and just trying to think about what it felt like, what were the sensations, what muscles am I supposed to be using, how much am I using them, and basically through a number of steps through these months, I kind of realized, well, the piano, I mean, it's going to sound ridiculously basic, but the piano creates a sound by pushing the keys down. So it's the act of pushing the key down that makes the hammer come up. So if we're holding the key down, the sound's already been made. You don't need to actually put any more muscular energy into the instrument, except that we just need to keep the key depressed. And I realized that it's not, with young students, it's a little bit trickier because their hands are so small and so light. But with my own anatomy, the weight of my hand, and even sometimes the weight of my finger, is enough to keep the key down and the note sustained. So all all you actually need to create a sound at the instrument is a tiny little impulse that makes the key go down that much, just from the top down to the bottom of the key bed, and then from then you can actually be completely relaxed, except that you just need a little bit of strength in your upper arms so your forearms don't fall. That's obviously not good. But basically, everything from the wrist joint down, and if we think about the muscles that are in our forearms that move our fingers and that hinge our wrists, everything in there can just completely relax. And it started me thinking, what about hand position? What can because you see these amazing virtuosic pianists, and it does seem like they have a very natural curved hand position, but I realized that that position automatically happens if you just relax your hand and put it on the keys. It's not kind of the perfect curved specimen that we kind of like to see, but it's a very natural position if you just let it rest there, suspend it with your wrists and fingers completely relaxed. So in terms of students, what I love to do is get them to imagine holding like a tennis ball, and that if you're kind of squeezing on the tennis ball, that energy, that muscular energy, is pretty fairly equal to what is happening when you're actually depressing the key. But once the key is down, you can drop the tennis ball. So I have, before they practice every day, I have them do some like 10 of these, hold the tennis ball, drop the tennis ball, hold the tennis ball, drop the tennis ball, just to get that feeling. And what we're really trying to do, what really kind of opened Pandora's box for me with this discovery is that you actually rid your playing of about 95 to 97% of the muscular energy that you actually probably end up using if you don't do this. So you end up using a fraction of the energy because the only time you're actually tensing your muscles is on the descent, is on the key descent, which takes what, 20th of a second probably. And then the rest of the time before you play the next note, you're just resting. So it took a long time, a couple of years of really solid belief in this approach, and I had doubts about it and all this, but I did notice that over the period of those couple of years, my dynamic range got better. I was able to control my voicing better. I was able to control phrasing better, fewer bumps. I could keep accompaniments softer and sing melodies more. So it wasn't just a purely physical thing. It helped the sound too, because the efficiency of the approach allows you to put more of your physical energy into the thing that's actually producing the sound. So when you're holding a chord, or when you're in between notes, you actually don't need any further muscular energy. It doesn't change the sound at all, and it actually kind of hinders a little bit of your control, because the smoothness of getting from one note to the next, that fluidity actually comes from relaxation rather than attention, because it's the freedom of movement that you need to get from one note to the next, and that freedom of movement comes more with relaxation than it does with tension. A lot of if we think, because I know that we're always, as pianists, we're always wrestling with how do we, a lot of it comes down to the wrist, right? How do we keep a fairly relaxed and supple wrist while having firm enough fingers that create a nice singing tone and all of this kind of stuff. And what I realized is that if your fingers are tense, your wrist is going to be as well. There's just nothing that you can, there's nothing you can do about that. If the muscles are tense that are pushing the keys down, your wrist isn't going to be able to move right. But all of a sudden, if you relax, so essentially when you, at the moment you play a chord, that very specific moment when you make impact with the bottom of the key bed, your wrist is actually super tight. And that's just the way it is, because that's how the body works. You just can't get around that. But if you relax the fingers within a split second of reaching the bottom of the bed, then your wrist can move around like jelly. And so what you end up having on a scale is that you have these very, very, very isolated short moments of tension, but you aim to make them as short as you possibly can so that the hindrance on your wrist moving laterally is as minimal as possible. And what I ended up really liking about this kind of theory, whatever you want to call it, is that because it's over a period of time. Now the period of time is incredibly short, but because it's over a period of time, even if it's a fraction of a second, in theory, you could get it infinitely smaller and smaller and smaller. So you could actually increase your efficiency ad infinitum until you're 120 years old, which I love the idea that you could actually continually improve this over the course of your life, no matter what age you are and how long you've been playing piano, and what level you are at that moment. So what it kind of did was it not only did it really start to help my nerves in terms of performance, in terms of competition, in terms of all of this kind of stuff, but it also gave me a much clearer goal in terms of something that I could always be working on. So I think one of the things that I'm interested in your experiences too, one of the things that I did struggle with as students sometimes is sitting down at the piano, knowing I need to spend time practicing, knowing I need to practice my pieces, but not always knowing what I needed to do to make it better. And this gave me essentially an infinitely long project that if I sat down at the piano, I knew that this is something that I could work to improve forever. And then, in terms of students, it gets a little bit tricky. I find that with young students in America, I was teaching all third levels. So third levels, even if they're not experienced pianists, found this idea interesting and could grasp it very, very well. With young students, especially in that kind of 9 to 11-year-old range, it's very hard to really be understanding these types of things. So I've kind of, and it's actually really been interesting to me to see how little actually 9 to 11-year-olds actually even think about what their muscles are doing. It's very much a do first approach, which is how I was at that age too. So that's maybe just the way a brain at that age works. But I think so. I've tried to do it from a more physical exercise sort of approach and just building it, feeling of it, rather than actually explaining the muscular anatomy, and really, how all of these things work. So what happened to me was for a few years, the injuries went away. It opened up my repertoire. There were all these great things that were happening. But I think I was focusing so heavily on the actual release of the tension part. And then I kind of, a couple of years late after that, I had this kind of rediscovery of, well, wait a minute, I'm not actually thinking all that much about how much tension I'm putting into the piano. So that led to the other side. So we kind of have, if you think of every note attack, if that happens at a certain point, we have this gradual buildup of tension in the finger and the arm, which reaches its peak. The top of the peak is basically the key hitting the key bed, and then we have the release of the tension afterwards. So that buildup, I started working on how do we want to make that more efficient. And basically, it's actually it's simpler. I think it's the less specialized movement because anybody can tense their fingers essentially. But what I did discover is that each joint, essentially, the joints are the things that we can control in our bodies to play any instrument really. Besides, the voice of basically air movement, but essentially as the joints get closer to the instrument, they become more. I am reluctant to say important, but they become the fact that there's strength in that joint becomes more impacting on the sound that comes out. So if you break down this joint, for example, which is exceedingly common, as I'm sure all you know in young students, breaking down that joint or breaking down that joint is, I equate it to hitting a tennis ball with a racket that has a hinge in it. So obviously, if you do that, when the hinge is flopping all over the place, you're not going to be able to control exactly what's going on. So you need to basically, from the key backwards, you need to ensure that that there is strength and active muscular strength put into that joint, and that it doesn't break down. And the amount of strength that you put in directly relates to the speed of descent and the intensity of the sound that comes out. So I know it sounds a bit dry, but I think having these really kind of basic elements covered then allows us to do all of the interpretive stuff, which I'll talk about in just a couple minutes. So the approach is very much finger first. You can create a sound with your finger and you don't need your wrist or your elbow or your shoulders at all. Now, there's a limit to the sounds that you're going to be able to create them. So all of this, and especially my teachers, and especially John O'Connor, is incredibly heavy on wrist movement and elbow movement and playing from your back to create the sound and all this stuff. And that is absolutely amazing. And for a while, I think I did ignore that a little bit to my own detriment. And since then, I've realized how important all of the other hinges in our body are, and the differences in the sounds that you can create by having a supple wrist movement or having some elbow movement, feeling like you're playing from the shoulders is absolutely amazing for big chords, big round sounds, and all that. But the finger is the most easily unpredictable thing. So it's the thing that you need to have covered first. then you can work your way backwards, or work your way larger, work your way away from constraints. So that is basically the physical kind of theory that that I thought about, and then that led into some more interpretive, discoveries. It was very interesting because I think there was a point where, in my mid-20s, where I got so unbelievably obsessed with the physicality of playing the instrument, because it was something that was really exciting, that I think my playing ended up kind of sounding quite cold. And very kind of methodical and thought out, yes, but it's limited, and I realized that you can't ignore, or at least the interpretive element of it can't be left up to complete chance. It's not about playing the pieces physically and then letting what you naturally do come out. You also have to plan every note you play, really very specifically with what emotional content you want to bring out. It seems obvious, but I think it's worth saying these things out loud too. And what I felt too was the more I actually got into an interpretive theory of things, the more specific it actually made my muscular anatomy too, because you're being more specific about the exact intensity of each note you're playing. So what I ended up kind of gleaning from this was this visualization of a three-dimensional grid. So it's not necessarily, it's much less about right and wrong interpretation. And this is something that I remember from John O'Connor's teaching as well, is that I would be sitting there and he would say, I actually don't care what you do. I either want to hate it or I want to love it, but I want you to do something. It's not that you're doing it right or wrong, it's that I'm not getting it. So it was essentially, how do I create a situation where I will always be able to make a decision, or decisions plural, about what I want to do? Because I'm sure we have all had experiences when we sit down with a piece and we're teaching a student with a piece and we're thinking, we're going, well, that could work, or this could work, but what works best, I don't know. And I remember being in the practice room, especially as a student, and kind of having this feeling of, I don't know what to do. And so that was the feeling that I was really trying to eradicate. And very similar to the physical theory, always having a goal in mind. With each note you play, you want to have a thought of how you're going to approach it physically. Same thing. Every note you play, you at least want to have 10 different ideas about how you want to approach it interpretively. And it might work or it might not, but at least you're moving in that direction, and through experience you can fine tune and hone that. So it's this idea of the three-dimensional grid. So we have the x-axis is your phrasing, it's your horizontal movement, you're up and down the phrase, crescendos, and you remember where are the important notes in the phrase and where you want to go. You have the y-axis, which is your voicing. If you're playing Baroque music, it's how you're layering different voices. If you're playing classical music, it's melody versus accompaniment, how you're voicing each chord, which notes in the chords are most important, and you have, you can play up to 10 notes at a time. So you've got infinite incisions that you can make. And then the z-axis is the timing, with rubato, timing certain parts and tempo of those, so there's also articulation, which you can kind of put under the under the umbrella of horizontal movement as well, because the spaces in between the notes. Pedaling is a little bit, might kind of fall slightly outside the grid, but it certainly produces sound. And really this ultimately came from, like the physicality part, trying to just break down the basic elements of, of music, which is sound over time, and then also try to break the piano down into its manipulatable elements. So we ask the question, what can we do at the piano with sound? And essentially, we can change the volume of the sound, or we can create spaces between the notes that we play. That's kind of it. And we can play multiple notes together, and we can change those volumes independently. But other than that, I hate to break it to you, there's not a whole lot else that we can do. We talk about having a singing tone, and we talk about creating all of these things, and absolutely. But the more I talked with people, especially piano technicians, the more I spoke with other pianists, the more I realized that this idea of tone is actually more an illusion. It's not actually a physical, it's not actually a real world physics, like to do with sound physics. It's not actually happening. It's something that happens orally in a listener or in a player whenever you produce a volume of tone that makes one voice prominent above another. And it becomes more singing and it becomes more cantabile, the better you control the horizontal aspect of it, the phrasing of it, and the balance of it above its accompaniment. One of the I'm just kind of something like that. That's not like that. It's not but creating that cantabile tone is not a matter of actually creating a physical sound vibration that sings versus another timbre. It's just the instrument is creating its own tone, and we are controlling that tone as finitely as possible. And actually, when we think about a Steinway, one of the ways in which Steinway markets their instruments is their tone quality. So that's the makers themselves are creating the tone, and what Steinway also purports to do is to have a larger number of tonal volume gradations within the overall range. So essentially you can control it more finely, and with the ups and the downs of the sound. And I stuck with that for a while. What I've realized is that there are things that happen that you can't always explain. So sometimes actually thinking, even if we completely are open and upfront about the fact that it's not real, thinking about it, especially with a young person, can change their sound rather than just saying, no, it needs to be louder if they think about it. So there's still benefit in thinking about things that aren't real. But so through my experience, these are kind of the two overarching is that the more you get into the very finite volume changes that happen within a voicing of a chord or a shaping of right in each note. So it's directly related to the muscular movements that you make, bring out, runs down, create the sound up out of the piano, and then the sound travels out to the audience. So with every note you play, there's this line that goes from your brain into the audience's brain. And that's kind of cool. So whenever I walk on stage and play something, or whatever, that's my visualization. And I love that every tool we talk about, there's something that I will always be able to at least make several pointed decisions about every note I'm going to play. And then when we come back, I might show a few, just do a little bit of a demonstration of some of the exercises that I use and some of the exercises that I teach to help students kind of get physically acquainted with these, with the, you know,
A little bit closer. The problem is the audio is a little bit quiet on the live stream, and I think it's because we're working off a hotspot as well. It's not the best.
Oh, I got
but I'm gonna move you a bit closer, and you're speaking out loud and clear, which is great.
Okay.
So that's good. But let me just
against the wood of the lid, just with these fingers, and they kind of start to feel that tension, you know, and it actually feels quite tense. You know, it really is. So, and then we do a little bit of this to start each lesson, and then otherwise I kind of just let them play naturally. It's like it's just something that we spend maybe 5 minutes on each time I see them. It's just so, especially when they're young, you know, you can only take so much of this kind of stuff, but we have to do something. So it's a few minutes each lesson, just getting them used to that feeling, and then we start on scales. And I think for me, you know, playing scales, of course, the local center exams and all the stuff, they require you to know all your scales and you want to get your grades and all that. So, but for scales, the real value for me is to use them as exercises like this. So C major, and I get them to push as though they were on the lid of the keyboard, and then they hold the tension, feel what it feels like to be tense, and then you drop the tennis ball. And you do, you know, and I tell them 10 minutes a day. If you can do 10 minutes a day of this, because it's mildly torturous, if you can just do this and then go to the other stuff and have fun doing the other stuff. But I feel like, especially in like the first year of playing, if you can instill this a little bit, it's really, really valuable. So push and hold for like 2 seconds, and then you release, and then push and then hold, and then release, and then push and hold and release, and then you do that. We have a few weeks where they do that, and then we talk about getting the hold portion of it, where you're holding the tension at the bottom of the key. That's the moment that you want to start diminishing as much as possible. So then we do, and you can do it with the metronome too. You know, you go push, hold, release, and push, too is that I know there's a lot of books out there that teach big finger, attacks from a high point. I don't actually see, I haven't been able to discover where the value lies there. I essentially get them to, especially actually similarly to what we were talking about with arm movements and stuff. When you play fast scales, there isn't time to be lifting your fingers up very high. So I get them to float on the keys and feel that your wrists and fingers are completely relaxed, and then you tense very fast, and then you increase kind of the metronome mark so that the tension that process of being tense and being relaxed gets sped up, and then after a while, it just starts to become a natural approach. Then, as we get into older students, early to mid-teens, then we can start getting into dotted rhythms. And dotted rhythms are really great because they allow you to, I know probably all of us have worked in dotted rhythms at some point, and we're taught, oh, it's a great way to practice. But it's funny because it really made me sit there and think, why is it good to practice? Why does it work? And I think the reason it works is because it gives you the ability to practice small bite-sized chunks of music up to tempo with only having to worry essentially about like one or two notes at a time, which is really great. And so you do, I mean, I remember, you have this, and what you do is you essentially transfer the exercises that we were working on with the scales, the tension and the release, into the long note of the dotted rhythm. So you have the tension release, and then you don't worry about the short note. You just play the short note as fast as you can, or ideally up to tempo. And then when you get to the next long note, you have your tension release again. And then every time you're doing tension release as fast as you can. You can even do that with the metronome too, although I haven't really done that myself. I did some metronome scales, and then when I get into dotted rhythms, I just try to do the tension release on the long note as fast as I possibly can. And then with the dotted rhythms, you just make sure that you do enough iterations of it. If you're doing 2-note dotted rhythms, then you make sure you give both notes the opportunity to be long. So, so you switch them back and forth, and if you're doing that, then you I haven't practiced that one in a while. And you go the first note long, and the second note long, the third note long, fourth note. And that's essentially it. I mean, the great thing about it is that I know it sounds like a lot of analysis. It sounds like a very kind of scientific way of approaching it, but actually it's quite simple because you basically have tension and release of the tension